There's a particular kind of silence that exists between a horse and a rider who trust each other completely. No pulling, no kicking, just breath and weight, and a kind of quiet conversation that doesn't need words. For most of his life, a horseman named Anders built his entire identity around that silence. He could read a spooked horse the way other people read a room. His hands, his seat, his legs, they were instruments, fine-tuned over decades, capable of calming 900 pounds of muscle with the smallest shift of pressure. Then, on an ordinary afternoon in March, all of that vanished in about 4 seconds. This is the story of what happens when the very thing that defines you is taken away, and what it takes to build it back, one impossible step at a time, with the help of a horse that had to learn an entirely new language just to carry him again. Anders didn't grow up wealthy, and he didn't grow up around horses the way some riders do, inheriting ponies from parents who already lived the equestrian life. His childhood was harder than that, unstable in ways that made animals feel safer than people. A neighbor's dog, a borrowed afternoon at a stable, anything with fur and a heartbeat became a kind of anchor. It wasn't until he was older that horses became more than an escape. He started at the bottom, the way most serious horsemen do, mucking stalls, hauling water, learning the unglamorous rhythms of barn life before anyone let him near a saddle, groom work for years, then, slowly, riding. By his 30s, he wasn't just riding, he was the person other people called when a horse was too much for them, too reactive, too anxious, too dangerous to handle. He specialized in groundwork, the kind of training where you study a horse's whole body from the ground before you ever climb on its back. He could walk into a paddock with an animal that had thrown 3 other riders and within 20 minutes have it following him on a loose rope. Horses weren't his job. They were the language he was most fluent in, more fluent some days than the language he spoke with people. He used to say that the times in his life when he didn't have an animal nearby, something always felt missing. He had no family to speak of, not really, just this, the work, the barns, the smell of hay and leather, and the particular trust that builds between a person and an animal large enough to kill them, but choosing not to. That trust was the center of his entire life. And then, in a single afternoon, his body forgot how to access it. It was an ordinary horse, not even his own, a friend's mare, strong-willed, a little headstrong, the kind of animal Anders had handled 1,000 times before, without a second thought. He swung up into the saddle the way he'd done every day for 20 years. There was no warning, no signal, nothing in her body language that told him what was coming. One moment he was settling into the seat. The next, the mare reared, straight up, hooves pawing air, and then her balance gave out backward. 600 kilos of horse came down directly on top of him. He would later say that his first thought, even before the pain fully registered, was simple: this has gone to hell. And then there's very little he remembers clearly. Fragments. The feeling of being lifted, the ambulance climbing the hill toward the farm, bright lights sliding past overhead, fast, faster, and then the trauma unit, and machines, and someone's voice asking him questions he couldn't quite answer. The damage was extensive. His pelvis was fractured in multiple places. The nerve bundle at the base of his spine, the network of nerves that controls so much of how the lower body moves and feels, was crushed. His sacrum, the great triangular bone at the base of the spine, was shattered badly enough that doctors couldn't even place a catheter in those first critical hours. The diagnosis, once they had one, was an incomplete spinal cord injury. Incomplete didn't mean lucky, it meant uncertain. It meant some signals between his brain and his legs were gone, and some weren't, and nobody could tell him yet which was which, or how much would come back, or whether any of it would. He had walked into that paddock as one of the most physically fluent horsemen in the region. He woke up in a hospital bed, unable to feel his own legs, with no idea if that would ever change. The months that followed weren't a single dramatic moment. They were slower than that, and in some ways harder. A long, unglamorous stretch of hospital ceilings, physical therapy rooms, and the particular exhaustion of relearning your own body from scratch. He has described that period as a kind of roller coaster, but not the kind people usually mean by that word. Not highs and lows of hope and despair exactly. More like a constant low hum of fear. Not fear of another accident, but a much quieter, more dangerous fear that the joy he had built his entire identity around might simply be gone. Permanently, that even if his body partially recovered, the part of him that used to feel completely at home on a horse's back might never come back online. He struggled, by his own account, to even recognize himself. The man in the wheelchair felt impossibly far from the man who used to gentle wild horses with nothing but patience and a lead rope, learning his new body, its new balance, its new limits, the strength it had lost, and the strength it would have to find somewhere else. felt, in his words, as distant as trying to walk across the Milky Way. There's a particular grief that doesn't get talked about enough, the grief of losing not a person, but a version of yourself. Anders was mourning a man who still technically existed, who was sitting right there, looking back at him in the mirror, but who could no longer do the one thing that had always made him feel whole. For a horseman, legs aren't just legs, they're half the vocabulary: pressure and release. A subtle squeeze that tells a 1,000-pound animal to move forward, sideways, to collect itself, to relax. Without that vocabulary, what was left of the conversation he'd spent his whole life learning to have? He didn't have an answer yet, but somewhere in those long months of hospital corridors and physical therapy, something in him refused to accept that the conversation was simply over. Recovery, when it eventually came, didn't begin in a riding arena. It began in his living room, on an old wooden saddle stand a friend had lent him, the kind of basic equipment used to train absolute beginners, propped up in his house like a piece of furniture nobody quite knew what to do with. He sat on that saddle stand for hours at a time, in those first months, just trying to relearn balance, not riding, not even close to riding. Just trying to remember how it felt to sit upright on something shaped like a horse's back, using muscles that no longer responded the way they used to. It would be easy to imagine this as a montage of steady improvement, but real recovery rarely works that cleanly. There were setbacks. There were days the saddle stand felt like a cruel joke, a reminder of everything he'd lost, rather than a path back to it. But he kept returning to it, day after day, because the alternative, letting go of horses entirely, wasn't something he could imagine surviving. Somewhere in that slow, repetitive, unglamorous process, a goal started to take shape. Not ride again, in some vague, someday sense. Something concrete, something almost absurdly ambitious for a man who, months earlier, hadn't been able to sit upright without support. Paradressage, the Paralympics, Los Angeles, 2028. He said it plainly, without embellishment. The road there is long. He knows exactly how long. But that's the goal, to ride in the Paralympics, in front of the world, on a horse he would have to rebuild a relationship with from the ground up, using a body that no longer worked the way it used to. It wasn't naive optimism. It was something more stubborn than that. It was a horseman refusing to let an accident decide, on its own, what the rest of his story would look like. Every rider who has ever lost the use of their legs faces the same brutal mathematical problem. So much of how you control a horse depends on physical strength you may no longer have. Leg pressure, core balance to absorb a sudden spook, the ability to physically outmuscle a 1,000-pound animal that's decided for half a second that the world is ending. Anders didn't have that math working in his favor anymore. So instead of trying to solve the old equation, he started building a new one. He found a horse, young, athletic, more sensitive and reactive than most, the kind of horse that years earlier he might have specifically chosen as a project precisely because of that sensitivity. But this time, the project wasn't just training the horse, it was training a partnership that could survive without the physical tools he used to rely on. He began replacing leg aids with his voice. A particular tone, a particular cadence, became the signal for slowing down, for relaxing, for trusting that nothing dangerous was about to happen. Where he once might have used a firm leg to correct a misstep, he now used the gentlest touch of a whip against the horse's side, not as punishment, never as punishment, but as the smallest possible substitute for a leg that could no longer do the job. And there was something else, something less technical and harder to train. The horse had to learn not to be afraid of him, not afraid of the wheelchair rolling toward the stall, not afraid of the unfamiliar way he now moved, transferred, balanced. Every motion that used to be fluid and automatic was now slower, more deliberate, sometimes unpredictable in ways a sensitive horse could easily misread as a threat. So before any of the traditional training began, there was simply this: time. Standing near the wheelchair, eating from a hand that approached differently than it used to, learning, slowly, that this particular human's new way of moving through the world wasn't something to fear. Anders has talked about protecting that bond as the single most important part of the entire process. The moment he starts focusing on protecting himself, bracing, tensing, worrying about his own safety instead of being fully present with the horse, that's the moment the connection breaks down. And a broken connection, for a rider in his position, isn't just disappointing, it's dangerous. His real protection was never going to be physical strength again. It was communication, it was presence, it was trust, built so deep that the horse didn't need his legs to know what he was asking for. He plays more than he used to, by his own account. makes things fun, finds small moments of joy in every session, even the difficult ones, even the ones in the wheelchair, because he learned something important in those dark hospital months. A horse can feel a person's fear, and it can feel a person's joy, and one of those things builds a partnership, while the other one destroys it. If you ask him what the foundation of it all is, the actual answer might surprise you for how simple it sounds. Not power, not control, joy. Make the sessions something the horse genuinely loves. Keep them short. Let go of pressure. A happy horse, he's found, makes nearly everything else possible, even when the rider on its back can't feel his own legs. It would be easy, telling a story like this, to skip ahead to a triumphant finish line, a medal, a perfect test, a crowd on its feet. That's not where this story is, not yet, and it might be doing Anders a disservice to pretend otherwise. What's true is this: he is still training, still building, still, most days, working through the unglamorous middle part of any comeback. The part with no cameras, no applause, just an arena, a horse, and the same patient repetition that built his entire career in the first place. The Paralympic goal hasn't gone anywhere. Los Angeles, 2028, is still the target he talks about openly, without hedging, even though he knows exactly how far away it still is, and how much work stands between where he is now and a start box at the actual games. He's also rebuilding more than just his riding. The same accident that took the use of his legs reshaped almost every part of daily life, from the practical realities of an electric wheelchair, expensive, occasionally damaged in transit, endlessly necessary, to the much larger question of who he is now, underneath all of it. He's described it as a kind of second version of himself, mentally tougher in some ways than he ever was before the accident, less afraid of risk, less afraid of another fall, because he's already survived the worst version of that fear, but more fragile in other ways too. The accident didn't just break bones, it introduced a permanent, quiet undercurrent of uncertainty into a life that used to feel completely solid. What hasn't changed, he says, is the love. If anything, it's grown stronger, sharpened by everything it survived. The horses are still the thing that makes him feel like a whole person. Maybe more than ever, now that being whole has had to mean something different than it used to. So the story doesn't end with a medal ceremony, because that part hasn't been written yet. It ends, for now, in an arena in southern Sweden. Golden evening light slanting across the sand, a horse moving calmly beneath a rider who talks to it now in a language neither one of them knew 2 years ago. Built from nothing but voice, patience, and the refusal to let go of the one thing that ever made him feel like himself. There's a particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage at all from the outside. It looks like a man sitting on a wooden saddle stand in his living room, hour after hour, trying to remember how to balance. It looks like hundreds of small, repetitive, unfilmed sessions in an arena, teaching a sensitive young horse to trust a voice instead of a leg. Nobody was watching most of it happen. There was no audience for the worst months in the hospital, and there's no audience now for most of the training sessions that are slowly, patiently building toward 2028. That's what real recovery actually looks like, most of the time. Not a single dramatic comeback, but thousands of unremarkable repetitions that nobody claps for. If you ask Anders what the secret is to riding without the use of your legs, to rebuilding trust with an animal large enough to end your life by accident, to finding your way back to the thing you thought you'd lost forever, his answer isn't complicated, even if living it clearly hasn't been easy. Joy. Let go of the pressure, make it something the horse loves and something you love too. Everything else he's found tends to follow from that. His legs may never fully come back. The man he was before that March afternoon might be gone for good, but the horseman, the part of him that speaks fluent trust, that turned an empty wheelchair and a borrowed saddle stand into the first steps of a Paralympic dream, that part of him never left at all. It just had to learn a new language to say the same thing it always said: I'm here and I'm not afraid, and neither should you be.